Hi guys, and welcome to another tutorial where we will do a quick review of ASP.NET Core, and in later tutorials we'll learn all aspects of web development including web APIs. With that said, let's get started in understanding the ASP.NET Core fundamentals. So here I'm going to assume that you guys have Visual Studio installed. I have the latest Visual Studio 2022. I'm going to go ahead and create a new project. So when you're opening a new project, as before, we used to create console applications, but this time we're creating web applications. So what we can do is go to all languages, depending on what you want to do. So in this case, we're writing C#. And then we're going to say all platform because ASP.NET Core is multi-platform. It'll run on Windows, iOS, or Linux. So we'll keep that all platform. And the project type, you could say cloud, which will give you some additional information about cloud, which is Azure functions and everything else. But this one, we specifically going to go to web. And this way we can narrow down all the templates that are available to us. So if we scroll up, the very first thing is this is the application that we're going to be creating. The ASP.NET Core Web App template is what we're going to use. We could go use the other ones. So this one is for Blazor. Blazor is basically the service. There's a server side and a client side where you can have C# code running within the browser, similar to JavaScript basically, which uses the WebAssembly. Then you have the web APIs. Web APIs is very similar to the web app, except that the web app produces HTML, whereas then the web API will produce some object that you can send back as an XML or JSON or some other format that you choose. The empty one is basically just an empty template, nothing in there as far as code, and you can add things to it. But if you're going to start up, just like we are, we're going to use the sample template so that it has at least 1 or 2 pages for us to kind of dissect and see how they've done things. And then you have the ASP.NET Core Web App. It's very similar to this one, except this is using the Razor pages, and we'll talk about that. Whereas this one is using Model View Controller. The Model View Controller is a pattern that is used. Basically, you have a controller which kind of acts like a traffic cop. When request comes in, a controller is activated. The controller will have actions. You can, for example, go to some database and have some business rules where you grab an object, and that object will be the model. And then the view is where it's going to be marrying the model and the view to generate the HTML and render it. So this way you're separating your data access, your business logic from the presentation side of it. And then you have this thing called gRPC. This is a remote procedure call service, an open source code that Google had created. And at some point we'll touch base on this, but not in this tutorial. And then you have Razor class libraries, so you can create your own libraries. And at some point we'll also look into this as well. And then the last two, before the last two here, we have ASP.NET Angular and ASP.NET with React.js. Basically, what we're doing here is using the Java framework for that's used to create Angular and React to generate the HTML. You can still have your code in C#. That's going to be going to the database or some data store, and then when you're rendering it, you're actually using the Java framework. Then you have the NUnit test project, something we haven't really talked about, which I think we should have a tutorial on this, where it's very important when you're doing development to have your code tested, and this becomes an automated way to where you can catch bugs and stuff. And then you have the Microsoft ASP.NET Web Application .NET Framework. Now, this is the old way of how things were done. This only runs in Windows, so we will not be looking at this because at some point the .NET Framework will be discontinued, and everything will be gone to the ASP.NET Core, so we're not going to touch that. And then this one is the WebDriver test for Edge. .NET Core. So if you're familiar with Selenium, Selenium is written in C# using WebDrivers for different browsers. Each browser will have their own drivers, and it uses that to automate the actions that you would perform on a browser. So this is used to test your website as similar in a fashion where if a user was clicking on it and doing different things. So when you run this, you would have like a browser, and then you can tell it, go click on this button, and you can then monitor the actions and stuff. And then we have the WCF services. I haven't really done a lot in my career with WCF, but they are being used, and there's another way of creating the services for web. And again, we're not going to touch base on these. I'm going to leave these alone. But if you really want to know and how they work, you can just send me a message and I will go ahead and do the tutorial for you. So with that said, let's go ahead and create this template and see what it does and dissect it. So the first thing is when you're creating your new project, it's going to ask for a project name. This is going to be the name of the project, and again it says project name, and then it's going to ask where do you want to dump this to. So here we're going to keep it as our default folder under repos, and then you have the solution name and what your solution name is going to be. So your solution and project name can be the same, and then you have a checkbox where you can decide where the solution and the project should be in the same directory. If you choose not to do this, the solution will be created, and then there'll be a folder called Web Application 1, and then all of the project files related to that will be inside of this. So we'll keep this as default, and go ahead and click Next. So now we're come into where we're going to choose our .NET framework. I only have .NET 6 in this machine, excuse me, .NET 6 on this system, so I'm going to leave it as that because this is the long-term support for it. And then we are presented with the authentication type. We're going to start off with an anonymous access, meaning a web page anyone can get to. So we're not going to set any kind of authentication, but you do have individual Microsoft identity and Windows. So let's go ahead and keep that as null. And then you also have this checkbox where you want to go and do this, configuring it for HTTPS. I'm going to uncheck this because for now we're just going to be looking at the web application and create some very simple pages. So we're not going to do anything with HTTPS, but as you'll know that currently everything you do on the web is using the HTTPS protocol. Next, you have this thing where you can enable Docker. Again, we're not going to do anything for Docker. We'll definitely come back and figure out how to deploy your services to a Docker container so you can upload it to a cloud or something. But for now, let's just keep that off the table. And so we're going to go ahead and keep everything else as is. Let's go ahead and create this template now. So once you created a template, you're presented with the solution, and notice this the name is Web Application 1 and the project is the Web Application 1. So if I was to go in the folder, you'll notice that we have the Web Application folder and then our solution, and then we have our project inside of this. Next, what we'll do is look at all of these different elements within our application. So as you know before, you can have a solution with multiple applications in here. So right now we only have one, and we'll keep it as one for now. Next, you have this thing called connected services. So if you had any kind of cloud or any other services, you would have that in here. For now, it's going to be just empty. We'll leave it as that. And then we have this thing called dependencies. The dependencies are actually the .NET framework we rely on. So we chose .NET 6. And if you look, we have the Microsoft .NET Core web app, which is the version 6.08. And then we have this other framework, which is the Microsoft ASP.NET Core app. So this framework is built using the .NET Core app. And since we're going to be servicing web requests, we're going to have a reference to this because everything depends on that. And then we have this thing called analyzers. So the analyzers are basically exactly as they say, analyzers, where as you write code, the analyzers will monitor what you're writing to Visual Studio pages, and if there's any recommendations or if you did anything wrong, it'll flag it for you so you can go back and take a look at what it is. You can also use analyzers when you're building your solution and projects to how it will react. So for now, we'll just keep everything as default. Next, you have this thing called properties. And the properties has this thing called launch settings.json. And this basically has 3 settings in here. And we'll go over this, but really quickly, because it's a web application, when you run this, you're going to have to choose what it's going to run as. Now, generally, we could build this and not run it, and then dump it into an IIS or some other web service, and then it would just function. So, but for now, because we're doing development, we have a choice of using IIS Express, which is this is option here, and then we have this thing called the web application, which uses Kestrel, which is a web service that internal to ASP.NET Core, and most likely will you be using this moving forward, but I will show you that you can run this under IIS Express as well. And then of course you have the IIS settings. This is when you're actually running it under the IIS. So, but again, we'll leave that be. Next, we have this thing called www-root with a different icon, and then we have the pages, and we'll go over in details what they are. And then you have this thing called app settings JSON. This is similar to a web config or a config file that you can have where you can have all your settings, and then you can read these settings and have your application behave a certain way based on the information inside of it. And then next we have our program.cs file. Now we created a web application, so why do we have a program.cs? Everything you do in .NET is going to have a program.cs. Now, because it's a web application, what we're doing is we're creating a web application host and then having some settings and then having it run. And so and later tutorials we'll look at how we can create our own basic host, default host, so that you can do certain things similar to what the ASP.NET Core folks have done in creating a web application, because it's fundamental to understand how this stuff works, and having all these settings. We're not going to go over these settings just now, but you just know that this is the file where it'll kick everything off. So next we have the pages, and the pages are, because this is Razor pages, they are ending with CS HTML, which is the C# HTML, and they have a code behind as well. So this is the page. If you notice, this is all HTML, but then we have some C# code here and some other directives in here, and we'll explain what these guys are in a minute. But notice that this HTML doesn't have a header, a body tag to display what this is. And how does that really actually work? Well, it works because there's a folder called shared, and there's a layout. So all pages will inherit from this. If you have a page like this, you can copy this and have like index 2 or some other page, about or contact that you can have, and it will inherit this layout for you. And where it says render body, and that's where it will render the content of your Razor page. You can have a Razor page where you're not sharing this layout, or you're sharing a different type of layout. You can have multiple different layouts in here. So we'll go over all of those, but for now we'll just keep everything simple to just what this sample is providing for us. So now, now that we have that, let's look at this index, which has the HTML, but then we have this code behind for it as well. And what is this code behind? So this code behind, if you notice that it has this method called onGet, but there's nothing really inside of it. But it also has a constructor of an index model, and this is a class that is inheriting from a page model. And if we go in here, notice that we have a reference to that index model class, which is this guy here. And what it's basically doing is that every time you request this index resource, this method gets executed, and we'll take a look at that in a few seconds. So let's go ahead and look at now what this www.root folder is. So this was basically all the pages and all the code that would run on the server. This is the basically your static files that's going to be referenced within your Razor pages or the layout that we had. It's going to have your CSS, you're going to have your JavaScript. And so the CSS, the cascading style sheet, is how you would format your HTML and style it basically. And then the JavaScript would be the code that you would run. This one is empty, of course, but you can have JavaScript in here that would interact with the page on the client side, which is the web browser. And then lastly, we have this library section where you have some libraries like, for example, Bootstrap. And all this information about Bootstrap is stored in here. Same thing with jQuery, jQuery validation, and the unobtrusive jQuery validation. And then you have this thing called favorite icon. We will go over how to use these libraries, but for now, this is required because it's going to do some formatting of the pages for us. So let's go ahead and actually run this to see this in action. Now, the first thing is that when you come in to run your project, you have this thing called web application. If you use a drop-down, you have the web application, IS Express, and WSL, right? So remember that we had the property section where it has a launch JSON. Well, that information is being extracted from here and being displayed for you. But then we have this thing WSL. Well, what is this? This is for when you had Docker container, then you can actually run that within the container. When you're building the application, you can actually remote debug it as well. But since we're not doing that, we'll only stick to the IS Express and the web application. So let's just go ahead and run the web application. And what it's doing is now we built a project and this on all the solution and all the projects underneath it. And then we have our web page being launched for us. So what happened was that when we built this and executed, the code got executed from here all the way up, did all of these settings, and then it said run. And in the run, we have a settings, and I'll show you that, where it says launch the browser. And this is the browser, and it's coming to the default page. And the default page is basically our index.html. So if we go to home, this is the default. If we go to privacy, we are going to the privacy page, which is this one, right? So now if you go back to the default, you'll have that in here. So now if we were to inspect this and look at the body, you'll have all of your jQuery references in here, and then you would have, for example, your links and stuff up here, and then this welcome over here, which is part of our index, right? So there's our welcome for H1, and then our link as a paragraph. So that's our welcome and then our link, but these guys are being shared as part of the layout. Okay, so there's our home page link and the privacy, and then our root web application. So the next thing is, notice this little icon on the tab that's in here. And if we go over here, So in the root, we have this favorite icon. If we open this, it's exactly the same icon. So what's happening is that whenever you're requesting this page, the icon is being displayed here. So if you wanted to make your own icon for your website, you would just go and name it faveicon.ico, and that will be referenced. If you want to name it something else, you would have to do a little bit more work in order to then get this to be part of the to be displayed in here. But it's a lot easier to keep it in that name and keep it in the same format. So if you wanted to just remember the pixel size is 32 by 32, so just have that in there and just overwrite this with that name, and everything should work just fine for you. So now we went over a very quick review of what we built as a template and everything that was stored in here. So now let's take a look at something else, and that is how our lease pages are working. So let's just do a quick review of the HTTP protocol. Now, I already have a video tutorial that talks about that. If you're going to do any kind of web development, it's extremely important to understand the HTTP protocol, at least the fundamentals. I don't mean for you to go read the RFC and understand every little bits of it. That's not gonna be necessary, but you do need to understand, for example, what the header is, what a cookie is. It would just understand the response requests that are happening between the client and the server. So here I have my web application inside of my client, and this client happens to be the Microsoft Edge. This is the Microsoft Edge that's built on top of Chromium, which is the Google browser. And so if I was to click home, a request is made from this client over to the server, which is basically this web application service. And if we look at the details of this, we ask for this the request that we make, and then we have some header information that's going in there, and then we have some request information, right? There are no messages. There's some timelines that you can look and see how long it took for this information to be displayed. So again, that's the link that we clicked, and this is the actual request that we were making. So when we made this request, it was a GET, and the response that we got was a 200, meaning that the server was able to understand our request and respond back to our request and give us this HTML data with a status of everything is okay. And you need to understand status codes. For example, a 404 would be like page not found. That would pretty much, you guys have seen that. Or maybe a 500 that could be an internal error, or some other 500 error that could be something else. And then you have this response header and the request header. So when an application, when you click on it, a request is made, and then when it goes to the server, a response is made, and our response is HTML. And so what the browser did was take this HTML, load it into this UI for us, and went and grabbed all of the styling and all the JavaScript and all of the HTML, formatted it, and presenting it to the browser for us. So that's a very basic review. Now we talked a little bit about the headers. Headers are, if you're talking about the HTTP request that is made, it has a URL that it needs to hit. That's the resource that it needs to go to. There has to be an identifier that tells it where to go. And then the header has some additional information, and cookies, for example, is part of the header that's going to go over to the server, and then you could read those cookies and decide what you want to do, maybe store some information for it for later on and so forth. So that's basically what a request is when the request goes to a server. But response is very much the same thing, except response will have a body, and then it can also contain header information. So if you were to write a cookie from the server, then it would write it to the header. It sends it to the browser so that the browser can then take that header and then use it for later on when it's sending another request to another resource on your site, right? So that's basically the internals that we went over. So now let's go ahead and actually comment this stuff out. So we're going to go ahead and stop and comment some of this stuff out and see what will happen. And let's go ahead and save this. And let's go ahead and run this. So when you run this, it says, hey, the page cannot be found. So we are able to hit the server, but the server is not understanding what it needs to do as far as responding. So it's just saying, hey, 404, document not found. Well, that's because there's nothing in here telling the request that how to map that to one of these pages, right? Even if I was to go here and put index, it's still not finding it, right? Now you can say, well, maybe it's case insensitive and it doesn't matter what that is. It doesn't know because there's no mapping. So now let's go understand what these guys did for us. Just go ahead and stop this. Let's uncomment this guy. So when you're saying, so we've created this web application builder, and then we're saying services add Razor pages. What does it mean? We're basically telling it that the Razor pages that we have here, configure those so that any request that comes in, the Razor pages will be configured and set up and ready to go. There are maybe authorization, the MVC core, there's some data annotation, some tag helpers, and the actual pages themselves will be configured and set up. So that's basically what that all means. Now, if I was to run this, I'm still not going to get the index pages that I want because all we did here is configure everything. So if you wanted to then have the pages mapped to these pages here, now that we have configured the services, then we can say go ahead and map the Razor pages, meaning that when a request comes in, go ahead and see if it matches one of these pages, and if it does, then let the page handle the request to render the HTML. Let's go ahead and run this. And this time we should see our page being rendered. But notice that our page doesn't have any of the prettiness that it had before, which was all of our CSS and everything else. So if we go to inspect this, and let's go back to our network section, and we will refresh this again. And now we're getting a bunch of 404 errors, and these 404 errors is basically our bootstrap and some CSS styling that we had, the jQuery stuff, and they're not accessible. Well, why is that? Because we have not enabled using static files. So if this was the server side of things, this is the client side of things, meaning those HTML files. These are static files, right? Images and so forth that would be also added here. So what we need to do is also now configure this to say enable use static files. So now if you run this, now things are looking pretty. And if we go to our inspect and go back to our network and refresh this again, pretty much everything looks okay, and the page is rendering all right. So then we have some other things here where it says use routing, use authorization. Since we're not doing anything for authentication stuff, we can definitely keep that off. We'll come back to this routing and we can keep this off for now as well. But we also have this thing over here where it says, hey, is the app development, and if there's any exceptions for it, to go to the error side of things, which is this page where we are actually displaying a lot more information. So if we look at the error page here, a lot of the request ID is basically getting passed back. And if you go to over here, we have our model request ID being displayed to let us know that, hey, there was an error and this is the request. So you could do some logging for it to see what's going on. So let's go ahead and go back to our program.cs, and let's go ahead and stop this and uncomment this guy. So now, how does this app environment is development configured, and how does the application know about this? Well, that was pretty easy, right? Because if you go back here in the launch settings, notice that we have this thing called ASP.NET Core _ environment, and we have this thing called development. This is an environment variable. And if you don't know what environment variables are, when an operating system launches, it'll have some environmental variables loaded into memory, and you can access this from anywhere from your system. Especially if you had like maybe a console application or something, or a Windows application, you want to get that, and you would have that. So let's take a look quickly where that stuff is. But you can also set these environment variables by default when you're starting things up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and to property section of my computer, and then we go to advanced settings, and then we have this button here that says environment variables. And here's all of my environment variables. So now we have user, and then we have system variables. Your system will be using that. For example, this path, when your system needs to do certain searches, let's say you kicked off an executable from the C colon or something from the console, and the executable doesn't exist in that path, then how will it know how to launch that executable? If it's in the search path in here, then it'll be able to figure that out. So that's how internally what the OS works. So basically that's what environment variables do for you. So when you're running this application, since we ran the web application using Kestrel, it came down and said, hey, look at the environment variables, and it's a key pair value, so this is the name of it, and it set its value to development. And then internally, what we did was we said the code in ASP.NET Core is going to go look at that and say, if the request is in development and an exception happens within the page, go ahead and redirect it to this error page. So that's how that really works. Now, to give you a better, clear idea of how this stuff works, what we could do is basically let's comment this stuff back again. We'll keep the static stuff in here. We'll keep the, well, you don't have to really keep this. We can do that as well. So we can actually do our own mapping, right? So we can say if someone calls foo, then we want to send it to, we're going to render something on the page for us. So how are we going to do that? Well, what I'm going to do is use the builder that we use here to build and have an application. We're going to say app.run. That's similar to what we've done here at the bottom beneath us, but I'm going to do it a little bit differently. And I'm going to say I'm going to do this asynchronously, but I know we haven't gone over asynchronous programming, and I promise at some point we will definitely come back and take a look at it, especially that we're doing web development, so I'll dedicate a tutorial for that. But for now, we're just going to use the async keyword, and the async keyword is going to say, let's get a execute this method, for example, asynchronously. Asynchronously is that we're not going to wait for it to finish. We're going to let it go, do its thing. When it's done, then it can come back and let us know what happened. And that's how it's done between the async and await. So we're going to say, go ahead and do this with a context. And So now we're going to basically create a delegate, and we're going to say if, let's say, if context dot. Now we're going to be dealing with the request, right? So we're going to say request dot, let's say, path, and then we're going to make this into a string. If the string ends with, and in this case we said foo, right? So we're going to say foo. Now because I'm using toString, if you notice now that we have overloads, and one of them have a string comparison. Now if someone says capitalized F versus lowercase f, we're gonna still treat it the same way. So let's go ahead and then have a ignore. So we're gonna say string comparison, which is an enum current culture ignore case, and that's what we're gonna set it for, so that now we don't care about the casing. And then now we are going to be inside of the if, and what we're going to do is we're going to say await. So every time you use an async, you have to put in a wait for it, and then we're going to say context. This time we're going to do a response. So now we're responding to the request, and we're going to say response dot write. So now we're going to write to the buffer basically, and what we're going to write is foo. Okay, and for everything else we're just going to say everything else. Okay, so now when we run this, if I then say /foo, we should see a writing of foo. But if I said, but if it's anything else, it'll be just this thing, everything else. Now, since we are starting this, it's going to hit the home page, so it's not going to have foo in it. What it's going to happen, we're going to go into the else, and we should see everything else. Let's go ahead and run this, and we have everything else. So now if we go to inspect this, it wrote it here, but we have to have body and head. So whenever you're writing to the buffer, you're reusing it's going to generate a HTML for you, and then it's posting this into the body. Now if we say foo with lowercase, we now get foo. So what we did was we forced the application to use to whatever we wanted here. So we could have actually, directed stuff and do additional maybe business logic where we can have you could control that, right? One thing to note here is now because it's C# and we can do this, let's put a breakpoint here. And let's go ahead and run this. We can see that the breakpoint actually breaks in here, and then we can, for example, continue do writing on that, and the response ends, and we're done. Now, does this get run every single time that the app or a page is requested? It does not, and I'll show you why. So now if I refresh, I should not hit that breakpoint, and we don't, right? Because the very first thing happened was when the application ran, this piece of code was executed. When you went inside of a run, basically because it's a service, or the way services works is that you continue to kind of loop and listen to see when a request comes in. When a request comes in and you have a listener, an HTTP listener in this case, and it captures that response that's coming in, and then it deals with it. So then why did this piece of code got executed? Well, it executed because if we go inside of this, this is a delegate, right? And that's exactly what we created, a delegate. So this is almost like a method basically, except this method doesn't have a name or anything. It just got registered here. That's going to be looking for certain paths and then do something on behalf of it. So this is as part of the context of the application, and whenever the application runs and it needs to call this delegate, and because this delegate is coded here, that's why I was able to break into this and only run this. It's not going to run everything else, every single request. So hopefully that was a little bit clear. So that's basically the fundamentals of what we can go over for now. Couple other things I wanted to kind of also go over is if you were to go to the index page, we said that this would be executed every time a get happens, and then how is it that it's able to map this logger stuff, who does all this work, and that's what we're going to go over next. Let's go ahead and end this. Let's go back to our program and let's go ahead and comment this stuff out, and let's go ahead and we can just uncomment this and uncomment this. Okay, so now that we have this, everything should work just fine. I'll go ahead and run this again. And let's go to our index. We'll just put a breakpoint. Of course, it's not doing anything, which is fine. So if you click home, notice that now every time a get request is made, you can put code in here to do something in there. So what if you were doing a post? So if you're familiar with HTTP, there are many HTTP verbs. The two most common ones that are being used is get and post. When we do web APIs, you'll get to see there's other ones like delete and put, options, and so forth. And so you'll see those in action when we do the web API. But for now, there'll be two of these. So if we were to do a post, then that would be on post. But then also notice that because we made the change, the browser will tell you that the source code doesn't match the compiled version, and so you're giving you that information where you can restart it. So we'll go ahead and do a quick restart on this, and of course the page is going to render. We hit that. Now when you're coming into your browser, the browser doesn't really have a way for us to tell it, hey, do a post here so we can put another breakpoint to watch this. There is a application that you could use called Postman, but for now we'll keep it as is. And we do some HTML stuff, you'll see that when you do post, we'll get to see how this stuff works. But for now, we'll just leave this in. So the next thing is, well, how does so here actually, if we go inside of this get, and I'll say logger.log, and I'm just gonna say this page is index, right? Oops. So we're just gonna log that this page is indexed, and that's pretty much all we're gonna say. So it requires a few more other things, like for example, it was the log level. We're gonna say informational, and then the actual message, and then it has some parameters. We're not gonna worry about that. It has additional properties, but for now we'll just keep this as is. And again, of course, you have that, and you have this other thing, well, it's called a hot reload. And so now if you were to go back to the home page and refresh, and notice that now we have this index being displayed. The first time was when we refreshed it and click this again. Notice that it's having this index page being written out. So let's go back here and put a breakpoint, and there we go, and we are logging that information. Let's actually kind of see everything. Now, the reason you saw these from previously and you didn't see it when I was refreshing it was because, and continue, actually let's take out this breakpoint. So as you refresh it, you keep seeing it, where before you were not able to see that. That's because when I came into the console and I did this, basically it's highlighted and it's pausing. It's sort of like pausing the console from displaying anything because I'm in the middle of like doing an edit or almost like an edit. So that's why it's nothing there. But if as soon as I hit enter, so that thing, excuse me, I have to be on it first. So now if I hit enter, so that thing goes away, then whatever was in its buffer is being printed out. So that's basically why that happened before. And now notice that when we did the hot reload, it took this piece of code, put it as part of the assembly, so we didn't have to stop and restart everything. So that's another nice feature that they've built in Visual Studio and .NET for doing that. So now let's go over the logging information, how this happened. Notice that when we went in here, we had this thing where it said add razor pages. There is a dependency injector inside of this. If you don't know what a dependency injector is, it's a topic that we should go over at some point. But basically what happens is that during the runtime, if you're calling, let's say, a class, in this case, we're calling this, oops, let's go to the index one. So here we're calling this index model class, which has a constructor. And in there, we have this parameter of iLogger, and it's a generic of index model that's being passed. Whenever the dependency injector sees this, then that's some configuration that needs to happen. It will inject a logger for you, so you don't have to. In the past, when you were creating classes, you would pass that parameter for the constructor, but here .NET is doing it for you because you configured it in the dependency injector, and when request was made, the dependency injector came into play and saw that you were asking for an iLogger, and it goes in, looks at the internal, and does this. So now this is already done for you in ASP.NET. That's why it kind of looks like it's magic, but it really isn't. And when we go and look at this and we do some stuff with the database and we use Entity Framework, and you need to pass a DB object or DB context, then you'll see how we're going to configure that for the dependency injector stuff. So that's basically how that happened. And the logging went into the console application. So one other thing is that if we were to stop this, and I did say that I was going to show you the IS Express one. So if you run this in the IS Express one, because this ended, so let's go ahead and close that, and it'll close. And if you run this as an IS Express, notice now that we don't have that console application. That was only available when we had the Kestrel, which was the actual web application being executed under. And so that was the actual web application. Under IIS, this is a assembly, and the IIS, because it's IIS Express, when a request is made to IIS Express, that request is being handled by IIS Express, and they'll route it to the correct pages for us. And so you're not able to see that console information, even though we're logging it here. And when we actually go to a section of this where we will talk about how to log stuff within your pages when exceptions happen and stuff, and where to dump that stuff, we will create our own logger to write that to some file, so that at a later point you can come take a look at, see what's going on, or maybe you want to put that in a database or some other place, and that will be helpful for that. But for now, I just wanted to show that difference between the IIS versus IIS Express. The same thing if this was an IIS, that would be exactly the same thing, right? IIS Express is just a trimmed down version of the IIS. And you can tell that because we have the IIS Express icon in here. So if we were to go there and say show all applications, here we only have one being executed. If I click this, I'll go to that home page. It shows the process that's going to run under. If you did task manager, then you could see that. If you had multiple applications being run, it'll show you in here as well. So you could do many different things here, and you can stop the site so that if you were to refresh this, you would get that. And of course that it stops the IIS Express. and then if you execute it again, it'll get launched, and then we have the IS Express again, and that's why we are able to see this page. Okay, I think that's pretty much everything that I wanted to cover in this topic, which was basically understanding the fundamentals of the web application that you can create under ASP.NET Core. Now, ASP.NET Core is much more broader topic, so in our next discussions and tutorials, we will look into how to create our own pages, modify this UI to be something a little bit more appealing, and what we could do is maybe create a very simple blog engine. It's not going to be something, you know, that it's just not going to be like a fully functional blog that you could go out. I mean, you can definitely use it and you can definitely expand on it and do different things for it. But this is just to show you how to get some kind of a get some database, get some data presented into the pages, so it gets you familiarized on how to work with these Razor pages and stuff. So that'll be our next tutorial. So for now, hopefully this was informative, and enjoy this tutorial, and we'll see you next time.